Hey there, truth seekers. I'm Larry Litton, your guide through the maze of modern politics and power dynamics on liberty, leadership, and lies. Each episode will challenge the narratives, expose the lies, and celebrate the leaders who champion true liberty. Get ready to question, learn, and maybe even change your mind. So let's dive into the truth together. Welcome to this week's episode, folks. For my fellow Tennesseans watching this, can you smell it? The stench of tyranny that is emanating from Nashville, specifically from the governor's mansion in Cordell Hall, the Capitol building. It is reaching peak levels of putridness right now. Bill Lee and his mafia capos of Cameron Sexton, Randy McNally, Jack Johnson, and William Lamberth are showing us all what the implementation of soft tyranny is. More on that later in the episode, though. Recapping my last week, it has been a whirlwind. Well, this whole engagement has been a whirlwind, let me tell you. Riverton to Gillette to Bowman, back to Gillette, down to Casper, back up to Gillette, then a return to Riverton, and now I'm waiting to catch my flight in Casper. 8 hotels, work in 3 states, traveled in and through 6 states, all in 19 days. And if you saw some of my social media posts, it snowed nearly every day that I was out here. Most of the time it was a light snow, but there were a couple of days of some serious snowfall. Also, nearly every day the wind chill made it feel like the temperatures were in the single digits and below zero on more than a couple of occasions. In fact, on Sunday, it was 30 below zero. It sure will be good to get home and snuggle up with my bride after being chilled to the bone for the past few weeks. Oh, and there have been some changes to my scheduled client engagements here in the future. They won't impact the show that much, and I will let you know what they are as we get closer to getting out of the starting gate with those changes. As I mentioned just a bit ago, I'm at the airport in Casper right now, waiting to board my flight home via connection in Denver. After that, I'll be home for a bit and taking care of getting the Goat Locker studio completely set up. I would like for it to be ready to possibly start doing some live streams in the future without the virtual Tennessee flag in the background. Anyway, enough of the update and on to the show. Did you hear that Governor Lee called for a convening of a special session of the General Assembly to consider his voucher scheme bill? Yeah, he sure did. Of course, he tied it to some long overdue disaster relief to his reasons for calling this special session, but only to give his primary reason a bit of cover, so to speak. Bill Lee's history of calling for special sessions of the General Assembly are somewhat thematic if you examine them closely. At the root of each time he has called for a special session, he has wanted to erode the people's liberty. We'll talk about that and more as we discuss the soft tyranny he and his cohorts are putting on display for the people of Tennessee. So let's take a stand in the arena together again this week, folks, and get on with the show. Welcome to Liberty, Leadership, and Lies, the podcast where we unravel the complex web of politics, power, and deception. Each week, we dive into the stories behind the headlines, exploring how liberty is eroded and the selfishness of our political leaders, as well as the lies that shape our world. Join us as we dissect the truth from fiction by examining the tactics used by the new aristocracy, the political class, at the local, state, and national levels of government as we dare to challenge the status quo. Get ready for thought-provoking discussions, exclusive interviews, and a journey into the heart of what really drives our society. Liberty, Leadership, and Lies, where your understanding of the world begins to change. Tune in every Monday morning and prepare to see beyond the veil. Yep, folks, Governor Lee will stoop to new lows in his plans to implement his voucher scheme here in Tennessee, including ignoring the state's constitution. Now, remind me again, which political party routinely ignores the Constitution to implement their tyranny? Correct. That would be the commies. What have I been telling you in the audience almost since the start of this podcast a few years ago? Correct again. Bill Lee is not a Republican. He is a transpublican. He is hiding behind the R because he is really a commie. And the same can be said about his henchmen in the General Assembly and the Tennessee Republican Party. Of course, I've been taking to social media to call the governor's latest actions out for exactly what they are. And I've received some pushback or people asking me just how did the governor ignore the Constitution? Well, that's going to require a bit of Civics 101 combined with a bit of common sense, sprinkled in with some critical thinking. Some people have said that I'm just sharing an opinion, but what I'm actually sharing is the plain language of our state's constitution along with the definitions of certain words. That is where the critical thinking and common sense should kick in, but there are people that are devoted apologists for our trans-publican governor. So much so that they turn off the portion of their brains that are needed to engage in the common sense that really isn't common anymore. I think that quote or something similar to it can be attributed to Voltaire. And what it means is that common sense is not as widespread as people would believe it is, or as widespread as it is needed to the proper functioning of a constitutional republic and a constitutional state where the system of government was established to protect the liberty of the people. So, let's get into the Civics 101 of how the not so illustrious governor has ignored the Constitution. Well, partially ignored it, as we shall see. As I mentioned in the opening segment, Governor Lee has called for the convening of a special session of the General Assembly, right after the regular session of the General Assembly already convened just a short time ago, less than 2 weeks ago to be precise. Now, Article 3, Section 9 of the Tennessee Constitution grants the governor the power, the authority to call for these special sessions. But let's examine the wording of this specific constitutional authority. Now, straight from the Constitution is this, quote, he may, on extraordinary occasions, convene the General Assembly by proclamation, in which he shall state specifically the purposes for which they are to convene. But they shall enter on no legislative business except that for which they were specifically called together, unquote. Now, as I mentioned, this authority is completely within the governor's listed authorities in our constitutional framework. But did you catch the key word and apparently to the governor, tricky phrase? Well, let me help everybody out here. Even the trans-publicans apologists out there. Extraordinary occasions. That implies, especially to those that like plain language and possess a modicum of common sense and are capable of critical thinking, that implies situations that are not part of the regular legislative calendar, but require immediate legislative attention. Extraordinary occasions, people, such as the reason behind the previous call for a special session, which was for, in his mind, and really placated his true supporters, the commies. His last call for a special session was to address, quote, public safety and response to crisis, unquote. In calling the previous special session, he wanted to address public safety. And keep in mind, the commies' default position on public safety is to disarm law-abiding citizens because they want everybody dependent on the government for public safety and definitely not dependent on themselves. Now, he did this in the aftermath of the Covenant school shooting in Nashville. That event created a significant leftist demand for legislative action on public safety, mental health, and gun control, which, of course, can be seen as an extraordinary occasion. The urgency to address these issues outside the normal legislative session underscores the exceptional nature of the situation. The mental health of the shooter was never specifically discussed, mainly because the government hid the mentally ill young woman's manifesto from the public for a significant period of time. But most of those types of mass shootings across the country have been carried out either by terrorists or by people suffering from the mental illness called gender dysphoria. The latter cannot ever be confronted in this country because that particular subgroup of humans or subgroup of American citizens has been given super top secret protected status by the government. But which part of the government specifically? Yes, the government that is composed of commies and transpublicans. And just like the commies' proposals for enhanced public safety that always include gun control, so did Governor Lee and his allies' proposals. Birds of a feather, right? Now, all we have to do to understand the plain language of the Constitution is look at the definition of the word extraordinary. So let's examine that, shall we? The word is defined as, quote, beyond what is usual, ordinary, regular, or established, unquote. So let's really break this down. Governor Bill Lee's latest call for a special session to consider a bill that has already been submitted, that poses a challenge in meeting the constitutional requirement of extraordinary as outlined in the Tennessee Constitution. Now, here's why this particular call might not align with a traditional understanding of extraordinary occasions. We're going to go over some of the same ground I just talked about here so the commies in the back can hear it clearly. The definition of extraordinary. The Tennessee's Constitution, Article 3, Section 8, stipulates that the governor can convene the General Assembly on extraordinary occasions. This implies the session should address issues that could not wait for the regular legislative session due to their urgency or unique circumstances. What is urgent about this school voucher scheme? What makes it extraordinary? I would like anybody that is defending the governor's decision to explain that to me. Explain it how this particular issue, school stamps, meets the constitutional requirement for extraordinary. Then there's this to consider. If the bill in question has already been submitted and is part of the regular legislative calendar, it suggests that the member could theoretically be addressed within the regular session's framework. This, too, reduces the argument for why it qualifies as an extraordinary situation, as the urgency or uniqueness required for such a session isn't present. Remember, Senator Jack Johnson and William Lamberth, Representative William Lamberth, the capos in Bill Lee's commie mafia, they both introduced Senate Bill 1 and House Bill 1 for consideration in the regular session of the General Assembly back in November of last year. Governor Lee's voucher scheme was already slated for consideration during the regular session, lessening even further any reason for it to be considered extraordinary. But our trans-Republican governor's treachery does not stop there. And let me explain. Because there is another thing to consider. His other reason for this special session includes not just the voucher bill, but also emergency disaster relief for the flood-ravaged counties in northeast Tennessee that happened due to Hurricane Helene. He and his mafia lieutenants believe they can convince the people of Tennessee that this adds an element of urgency and might justify the session as extraordinary, but in part only. But remember, this inclusion of his voucher scheme bill that was already in the legislative pipeline, alongside emergency measures, it should be seen by us, people that exercise common sense and a bit of critical thinking, as stretching the definition of extraordinary. Commies are really good at that. Remember, control the language, control the narrative, control the outcome. But not only that, but calling for a special session now to consider emergency relief due to hurricane damage should have the people up in arms. Hurricane Helene hit Tennessee in late September, and the incompetence of the federal government and its response was quite evident by at least the end of October, if not the middle of October. Why did he not take action then? Could it be because House Bill 1 and Senate Bill 1 was introduced on the 4th of November, and it was receiving a lot of pushback from conservatives and actual Republicans across the state? It was even receiving pushback from teachers and teachers' unions and Democrats across the state, despite the $2,000 per teacher bribe that was written in this bill. I believe Governor Lee needed an actual extraordinary reason to call for a special session and delayed calling for it sooner to deal with the hurricane damage so he could piggyback his voucher scheme on top of the hurricane relief. Because he discovered the enormous resistance to his voucher scheme was quite evident and it would probably not pass in the regular session. That, ladies and gentlemen, isn't misfeasance. It's malfeasance of the highest order. He was elected to serve the people of Tennessee, and he delayed much needed disaster relief for East Tennessee on purpose. Yes, on purpose, because he needed something that could help him get his globalist voucher scheme over the finish line. I'm going to take a quick break right here and continue this on the other side. So stick with me as we pull back the veil on Governor Lee's pathologic need to purchase a legacy with taxpayer money and his desire to please his globalist and out-of-state buddies by getting his voucher scheme imposed on Tennesseans. All right, let's continue the breakdown of the soft tyranny that is being put on display here in Tennessee. First, though, many of you may be thinking, what does soft tyranny mean? Well, that is the slow erosion of our liberty through actions taken by people elected to office. It is the beginning of what becomes the hard tyranny that takes a fight to overthrow. Soft tyranny are the steps taken under the guise of the favorite words used by tyrants and their minions while they accumulate and consolidate their power. It is also the phase of tyranny that can be easily stopped if, and only if, we the people can actually examine the end results or contemplate what the end results of what these tyrants propose and enact. So back to the quasi, but mostly unconstitutional action by trans-Publican Governor Bill Lee calling for a special session of the General Assembly. And he's doing this to consider primarily his school voucher scheme bill. It is a situation of political strategy versus constitutional necessity. There is a strategic political angle here where calling this special session will be used to leverage or highlight his and his globalist and big money special interest specific legislative priorities on school vouchers. However, from a constitutional perspective, this reason cannot be viewed as extraordinary because there has not been a demonstrated public need for immediate action beyond what the regular session can accommodate. That is not of any concern to Bill Lee because, to him, there is an immediate personal need for his legislation. Actually, two needs. The first being he needs to try and cement a legacy as well as a precedence for his brand of as school voucher schemes. The second need is that he has to placate all of the out-of-state and globalist organizations that poured millions of dollars into the elections here in Tennessee during last year's primary and general elections. These groups spent large sums of money getting the right people into office that would support the governor in this action. More importantly, though, they spent large sums of money to ensure actual conservatives were not elected to office. For my fellow Sevier County residents, that is why it will be very important to watch how the two representatives and two senators that represent our county in the General Assembly respond to this situation. Not only have I emailed my representative, Representative Ashley, and my senator, Senator Steele, I've also called their offices in Nashville. By the way, the two individuals that answer the phones are polite as all get out. They were very pleasant, and I really enjoyed talking to them. I asked both of them, Ashley and Seals, to call for an immediate adjournment of the special session once it convenes, because it does not meet the constitutionality requirement of extraordinary. If any of our elected representatives do not call for that, you know where they fall on the political spectrum. Well, at least the school voucher scheme doesn't meet the extraordinary requirements. But like I said earlier, Governor Lee did throw in that hurricane relief so he could give it some cover. For everybody in East Tennessee that watches or listens to this podcast, Please keep in mind that the governor could have called for a special session in October, November, or December to consider disaster relief, but chose not to do so. All to give this school voucher scheme a chance because of the pushback it was receiving all over the state prior to the convening of the regular session. Now let's talk about the historical and legal interpretations. Historically, special sessions have been called for issues that clearly couldn't wait for the next regular session, like immediate responses to natural disasters, significant public safety crises, or urgent economic matters. For this session to meet the extraordinary standard, there would need to be a compelling argument that the timing of the voucher bill or its related legislation is so critical that it cannot wait for the regular legislative session, which, keep in mind, was already convened. Nobody can clearly define what the urgent need for the passage of this legislation is. Nobody. Absolutely zero. But in the commies' minds, it needs to be now because it would not survive a regular session legislative fight in subcommittee or even on the floor. Governor Lee knows that, hence his action last week. He released his signed proclamation on Friday. Now, if enough Tennesseans call and email their representatives and senators about this tyrannical attempt to purchase a legacy, it should generate the correct perception among legislators whether this session is seen as meeting the extraordinary requirement. If enough of us talk about this at our churches, at work, at social events, and with our neighbors, we could also generate that same perception of reality among the voters here in Tennessee. You can also take to social media and call out the governor for his blatant attempt to circumvent the Constitution to push this scheme down the voters' throats. If there's broad consensus that the matter at hand like this lie our so-called Republican governor and his henchmen are spreading that only government can provide for educational choice, it needs to be called out for what it is and that it does not meet the constitutional requirement as an extraordinary circumstance. Now, if we all do that, it might move everybody to be starting to engage with some common sense and some critical thinking. So in a quick summary before I go into the mechanics behind why the governor called for a special session instead of letting his education for freedom bill. Now, while the inclusion of emergency aid in the special session provides some basis for urgency, the focus on a bill already part of the legislative calendar should raise questions not only among the citizens, but every member of the General Assembly about the constitutionality under the extraordinary criteria. The governor will not and cannot demonstrate a clear and immediate need for his liberty robbing, wealth redistribution, and government overreach bill to be addressed outside the regular session schedule, and it can't be convincing to meet this requirement. If you're an observer of the mechanics of a regular session of the General Assembly, and with the new rules package in place, you know that every bill goes through a committee process, and some of them take the entire 3 or so months the General Assembly is in session to get hammered out in both chambers, get hammered out into a bill that makes it to the governor's desk to be signed. The committee process is open to some levels of scrutiny where the citizens can be engaged with the lawmakers. In other words, there isn't a rush and there's a modicum of transparency involved in this process. That process does not exist in special sessions. First, they are typically concluded within a week. And while the legislation they are convened to consider isn't the large volume of what takes place during the regular session, it is still very rushed, and it involves a lot of backroom deals that are not open to the public. Do you understand now why the large sums of out-of-state special interest money was spent during our last elections here in Tennessee? To get in the minds of the globalists and special interest groups, to get the right people elected, and more importantly, prevent true conservatives from winning. Because true conservatives would not participate in backroom deals that would erode the liberty of the people, create a new entitlement program, or grow the size and scope of government. True conservatives would follow their oaths. Not so with in many cases, unprincipled people that school voucher supporting organizations pushed over the finish line with their money. Too many voters bought into their propaganda that they were selling, or they were too apathetic to show up and vote during the primaries. That we now have a General Assembly that is probably willing to sell out the people's liberty for personal gain, be that power, prestige, control, access. That is why the governor absolutely needed to push this bill into a special session. After learning there was not widespread support across the state for his lie that it takes the government to provide parents the choice in how their children are educated. That is why this bill will double fund education through these so-called scholarships while continuingly to fully funding school districts that have children leaving their systems and go to a private school. That is why this bill bribes teachers for their support for vouchers and does not address the root cause of failing public or government schools. This bill does not encourage competition among the three different methods of educating children. Instead, it only serves to crush government's competition in the realm of education by co-opting some of the private school institutions that will accept this government money. Ladies and gentlemen, if there is one thing the people of this state and this nation should have learned over the course of the past few decades is this: more government is never the solution to government-caused problems. Less government leads to freedom and prosperity for the people. So that's it for this week. I'm going to pause and come back for my closing thoughts and this week's wisdom from God's Word. Stay tuned. I'll be right back. Now, you know what? I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge what a great day in the history of our republic that today is. The culmination of the biggest comeback in political history happens today when Donald Trump is sworn into office again. Like many of you that listen to this program, this is exciting for us and hopefully is the beginning of the end of many of the ills that happened to our country when the 2020 election was stolen. We are hoping for the righting of many wrongs and the return to a more prosperous and more freer America. It is too bad that I will be in the air when that happens, but I'm quite sure there will be many moments captured by all sorts of media outlets that I'll analyze and pull the veil back on and share with you the real meaning behind some of their words and actions. For now, though, I'm going to close this week with a modification to last week's call to action. In addition to calling your representatives and your senators to have them oppose Governor Lee's expansion of government and the creation of a new entitlement program, call them and ask them to motion to immediately adjourn the special session when it is gavelled in on the 27th of January. Tell them that Governor Lee's call for a special session to consider his voucher bill does not meet the constitutional requirement of an extraordinary occasion as it is written in the plain language of Article 3, Section 8 of our state's Constitution. Governor Lee's legacy, regardless of what he thinks about it, is most assuredly not extraordinary in any sense of the measure. And I forgot to mention this. Even Donald Trump, in addition to calling Bill Lee a rhino a few months ago, called out one of the primary groups pushing for this school voucher scheme here in Tennessee that is headed by Charles Coke. He called the group Americans for Prosperity what they should actually be called: Americans for No Prosperity, because when the government grows, the people don't prosper. I sure am happy to have some mean tweets and postbacks anyway. So, call and email your rep and your senator. Do it a lot. On to this week's wisdom from God's Word, and it comes to us from the book of Proverbs, chapter 8, verse 13. The fear of the Lord is hatred of evil. Pride and arrogance and the way of evil and perverted speech I hate. It is the epitome of pride and arrogance for our governor and his mafia capos to try to convince the citizens of this great state that only government can provide them the choice in how to educate their children. We need to remind them of their roles, their oaths, and that the source of political power in Tennessee and in this country is we the people, not we the government. Until next week, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a stand in the arena together. Reveille, it's time to wake up.